Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada Jaya Prabhupada. Jaya Om Vishnupad Paramhamsa Paramajakacharya Do Tarasata Shri Srimad Divine Grace A. C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki. All glories to some devotees. All glories to some devotees. All glories to some devotees. All glories to Sri Sri Guru and Sri Gauranga. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Ajnanatimidandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tajmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swarupa Kadamayam Didati Swapadantikam Vandehang Shri Guru Shri Yuta Padakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavam Cha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadhunam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakan Vitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavan Eshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Hari Priye Vanchakalpa Tarubhyascha Kripa Sindhu Bhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasari Gaur Bhaktavrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. So, nothing's happening today the way I expected to. All right, so I understand that we are on Canto 3, Chapter 14, Text 27. Is that correct? Let me get to it on my phone here. Pregnancy of DT in the evening. Yasyanavadyarchitam manishino. Yasyanavadyarchitam manishino. Grananti avidya patalam. Grananti avidya patalam bibitsavaha. Grananti avidya patalam bibitsavaha. Nirasta samyati sayopyayat svayam. Nirasta samyati sayopyat svayam. Pishachacharyam acharadgati satam. Yasyanavardyarchitam manishino. Grinanti avidya pakalam bibitsavaha. Nirasta samyati sayopiyat svayam. Pishachacharyam acharadgati satam. Yasyanavardyarchitam manishino. Grananti vidya pakalam bibitsavaha. Nirasta samyati shayopiyat svayam. Pishachacharyam acharadgati satam. Yasyanavardyarchitam manishino. Grananti vidya patalam bibitsavaha. Nimasta samyati sayopiyat svayam. Pishachacharyam acharadgati. Yasyanavadyarchitam manishino. Grananti vidya patalam bibitsavaha. Nirasta samyati sayopiyat svayam. Pishachacharyam acharadgati satam. Yasyanavardyarchitam manishino. Grinanti vidyam patalam bibitsavaha. Nirasta samyati shayopiyat svayam. Pishachachayam acharat gatim satam. Vaishnavis? Yes, Yanavardya chitam manishino. Grinhanti vidya patralam bibhitsavaha. Nirhasta samyati sayopiyatsayam. Pishachacharyam acharad gati satam. Yasyanuvadya chitam manishino. Grinhanti vidya patalam bibitsavaha. Nirasta samyati shayopiyatsvayam. Pishachacharyam acharad gati satam. Yasya whose anavadya, unimpeachable, architam, character, manishinaha, great sages, gurnanti, follow, avidya, nescience, patralam, mass, bibitsavaha, desiring to dismantle, nirasta, nullified, samya, equality, atishayaha, greatness, api, in spite of, yat, as, svayam, personally, pishacha, devil, charyam, activities, acharat, performed, gatihi, destination, satam, of the devotees of the Lord. So the translation reads, although no one in the material world is equal to or greater than Lord Shiva, and although his unimpeachable character is followed by great souls to dismantle the mass of nescience, he nevertheless remains as if a devil to give salvation to all devotees of the Lord. So, responsively, we can read together. Although no one in the material world is equal to or greater than Lord Shiva, and although his impeachable character is followed by great souls to dismantle the mass of nescience, he nevertheless remains as if a devil to give salvation to all devotees of the Lord. Okay, so here's Prabhupada's short purport. Lord Shiva's uncivilized devilish characteristics are never abominable because he teaches the sincere devotees of the Lord how to practice detachment from material enjoyment. He is called Mahadev, or the greatest of all demigods. And no one is equal to or greater than him in the material world. He is almost equal with Lord Vishnu, although he always associates with Maya, Durga. He is above the reactionary stage of the three modes of material nature. And although he is in charge of devilish characters in the modes of ignorance, he is not affected by such association. Yasyanuvadhyarchitam manishino grinanti vidya patalam bibitsavaha nirasta samyati shayopi yatsvayam pishachacharyam acharad gati satam. Although no one in the material world is equal to or greater than Lord Shiva, and although his unimpeachable character is followed by great souls to dismantle the mass of nescience, he nevertheless remains as if a devil to give salvation to all devotees of the Lord. One thing I've always thought, but I don't know if it's true or not, is that it's interesting that the Christian depiction usually of the devil is, of course, that he's red and he has horns and he holds a pitchfork. Now we know that Shiva has a trident, so maybe there's some connection there that somehow or other the Christian concept of the devil came from Shiva. Of course, Shiva's nothing like the Christian concept of the devil. Shiva's not at all inclining people towards sinful life. As a matter of fact, quite the opposite. Shiva is sometimes called Bhutanat, in other words, he's the one who tries to help those people who are in probably the bottom of the barrel karma to rise up. So he is in charge of the Halloween people. So he manages to find good bodies for them so they can be released from devilish life. And in this way, he does a great service. And so those who are ghosts, demons, rakshasas, and Brahma Rakshasa ghosts and people like that, they are usually followers of Lord Shiva. And those who are given especially to heavy-duty intoxication, they also generally are followers of Lord Shiva. Though as our Arjunananda yesterday described that Shaivites are not necessarily in this category. So some of them actually worship the Supreme as Shiva, because as we were hearing yesterday, there are different types of Shiva. In fact, Shivology is quite a broad study. There's a lot of things to understand if you want to understand Shiva. But I'm not really going to go down that road today, because today is, of course, Balaram's appearance day. And I thought it was probably more appropriate to speak about Lord Balaram. So kind of turning the page, switching the topic, we will forthwith move on to describing or discussing something about Lord Balaram. So, Lord Balaram, ontologically speaking, you probably all know what ontology means. Ontology is the study of what is, or what exists, and exactly how it exists. So, Lord Balaram is described as the first expansion of Krishna. So, Krishna has innumerable expansions. And Ramadi Murtishu, I forget what the whole verse, what is it? Yeah, Ramadi Murtishu Kala, what is it? Kala? Okay, so that verse from the Brahma Samhita explains that there are many, many expansions coming from Krishna. But the very first one is Balaram. And so from Balaram then come eventually the Chaturvyuha, the first Chaturvyuha, then there's the second Chaturvyuha. And then we get the Purusha avatars, and so on and so forth. So he is understood to be the source of all spiritual strength. So that's where the word Bala comes from. Bala means strength, so Balaram, he's the source of spiritual strength. He's also considered to be the original spiritual master. So he's the source of all spiritual strength. He's the original spiritual master. And we know that Krishna and Balaram, they advent themselves as Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and Nityananda. So we have that aspect as well. And in that way, they perform pastimes, and they're eternally together. The story is that when Lord Ramachandra banished Sita to, Ramachandra was examining his kingdom in disguise as a spy for himself, and one man made a remark to his wife who had been away in the night that he would not accept her back, unlike Lord Ramachandra, who accepted Sita back after she was stolen by Ravana. So because of this remark, Ramachandra banished Sita, and Ramachandra asked his younger brother to take Sita and remove her to a distant location. And this so much bothered Lord Ramachandra's brother that he vowed he would never again take birth as Krishna's younger brother. He would take birth only as Krishna's older brother, because older brothers do not have to do what younger brothers ask them to do, whereas younger brothers are obliged to do what the older brother asks of them. So he would never again do that, and that's why Balaram is older than Krishna. And of course, we know the basic story that there were 6 children born to Vasudeva and Devaki, and one after another, these children were killed by Kamsa. For 10 points, they were killed by Kamsa. So Kamsa had heard that the 8th child would kill him. So 6 children were born from Vasudeva and Devaki. They were all killed. At first, of course, Kamsa gave back the first child, and then Narada Muni came and explained to him, well, we don't know which is going to be the 8th child. Are we counting from the first one being number 1, or will it be the last one that's number 1 and we're counting backwards? When Narada Muni put this doubt into Kamsa's mind, and he decided, we kill them all. We don't know what the order will be, and who knows. So therefore, he was killing all the children. And there's a story with the first 6 children that we will skip. And the 7th child, or the 7th pregnancy of Devaki, was Ananta. So that is Balaram, actually. And Balaram was going to be Krishna's brother. However, at the same time, Yashoda Devi was pregnant with the child that would become Krishna's sister. So this is Yogamaya. And sometimes this is described as Yogamaya, but when she's actually born, we find that she is Durga, or Mahamaya. So Yogamaya, Mahamaya, one is an expansion of the other. Mahamaya is expansion of Yogamaya. So the child will be switched. So Krishna, who would be the 8th child, of course, what happens to the 7th child? She is instructed to be switched. So the 7th child, who is Balaram, is switched to the womb of Rohini. So because he's attracted to the womb of Rohini, he's called Sankarshan. So the 7th child, which was to be Balaram, who was going to be born from Devaki, is instead born from Rohini. And then, of course, that child is considered a miscarriage. And then, of course, the 8th child is Krishna. And that child, the 8th child, will be swapped from the jail cell of Vasudeva and Devaki for the child that is born to Yashoda. And then, of course, Kamsa will try to kill what he imagines to be the eighth child, but that's in fact the switch that Vasudeva has done, and she is Durga Devi, who is actually Kamsa's worshipable deity, and of course she slips out of his hand and explains to him that the child that's born to kill him is already there, and that child, of course, is in Vrindavan. So we know that Krishna and Balaram, they grow up together. They have pastimes as children that sometimes they let loose, because of course both Krishna and Balaram, they're growing up in a rural setting in Vrindavan, and they are cowherds, born to a set of men and women whose lives are focused around raising cows and getting milk and agriculture. So sometimes they're always performing mischief. So they release the little calves, and the calves drink more milk than they normally would. And being people who are involved in the process of selling milk, this is not good for them. And sometimes they take the little calves and they grab their tails. When they grab the tails, the calf gets frightened, and they don't let go of the tails, so the calf runs and kind of drags them through the mud and the dirt on the ground. And in this way they have their fun, and I'm sure it was interesting to try to do the laundry after that. But this is some of the pastimes that they have as children. And some will understand that Krishna is actually the son of Vasudeva, but some will not understand that. And of course, Nanda and Yashoda always think of Krishna and Balaram as their child. In fact, they are the ones who raised Krishna and Balaram. And we find that Devaki and Vasudeva, although they're the actual biological parents, they are bereft of Krishna and Balaram's association until much later, when Krishna and Balaram will go back to Mathura. And of course, the reason why they go back to Mathura is that Kamsa finds out that Krishna is actually living in Vrindavan. And so he wants to get rid of Krishna once and for all. And therefore, he sends Akrura to go and fetch Krishna and Balaram from Vrindavan. And Akrura is so overjoyed. You would think, why would Akrura be overjoyed that he's bringing Krishna and Balaram to be slaughtered by Kamsa? Well, first of all, Akrura knows that Kamsa will not be able to harm Krishna and Balaram, but he gets an opportunity to actually associate with Krishna and Balaram. So he's very happy about this opportunity. And of course, when he comes to Vrindavan, he mentions that Krishna and Balaram's presence are required in Mathura. There's going to be a big wrestling match that has been scheduled, and the king, who is Kamsa, wishes to have their presence there. And so for this reason, he's inviting Krishna and Balaram to come with him on the chariot and go to Mathura. And Krishna and Balaram agree, to which the gopis are shocked. They cannot at all agree to this idea that Krishna and Balaram should go to Mathura. They couldn't stand to be away from Krishna and Balaram for even part of a day, but he's claiming he's going to be gone for a few days, but they almost as if they intuitively know that this is not really going to play out this way. That actually, if Akrura is allowed to take them, then Akrura will wind up taking them forever. So they try to stop Krishna. When the chariot is getting ready to disembark from Vrindavan, the gopis try to stop the horses, and they're pleading with Krishna, please don't go. And he says, I'll be back in a few days. I'll be back in a few days. And when finally Krishna takes off, they are shocked and stunned. They can hardly move. And actually, the gopis wind up cursing Akrura for taking Krishna away from them. And one of the first out of Vrindavan pastimes that we hear is this pastime of Krishna and Balaram coming into Mathura. So Mathura is not that far from Vrindavan, but Krishna and Balaram have never been out of Vrindavan. They've lived their entire lives within the area known as Vrindavan, and now they're coming into Mathura, which is the big city, in quotation marks, and it is the capital city of Kamsa, where he has his government set up. And they've been brought there by Akrura, and Akrura says, please, you must come to my house. I want to serve you nicely. And Krishna and Balaram say, we will do that in time. But it describes in the Krishna book that as they're coming to Mathura, they see how magnificent the city is, that it's got this big gate that's very impressive, made out of stone, and the door to the gate of Mathura is solid gold, and there is a moat or a canals built all around the city, so the city's protected and it's not easy to attack it. And when they come, the first person they meet, does anybody remember who the first person they meet when they come into Mathura is? Well, yes. Well, he's not really the cloth seller. He's a washerman, is how they. And he dyes clothes actually. So he's got the cloth. Evidently not clothes, just cloth. And so Krishna, in an unabashed way, walks up to him and says, "My dear washerman, why don't you give us some of this best cloth that you have?" Giving him an opportunity for service. And this is kind of, just shows how you've got two very different kinds of people. Some that are immediately attracted by Krishna and will feel an automatic outpouring, wanting to do whatever Krishna says. But in this case, the washerman is not one of this kind. He's one that was very materialistic and also very focused on Kamsa. So he said, my dear boys, you making a mistake here. This cloth is meant for the king, not you. And if you know what's good for you, you won't make this kind of mistake again by asking for items which are actually destined for the king. And so in this way, he tries to rebuke Krishna and Balaram. And Krishna becomes angry by this. And just by his hand, he takes off the head of the washerman. He doesn't need a knife, or, mentions in Krishna book that Krishna can do anything. So just with his hand, he cuts off the head of the washerman. And then Krishna and Balaram pick through what's there. They've got pick of everything. So Krishna, I like this piece of cloth, and Balaram likes that piece of cloth. Then, they meet a tailor who is also there, and the tailor says, well, I'll make this and whatever. So spontaneously the tailor comes forward and says that he'll take this cloth and make something out of it for them. So, they get outfitted. Here they are in a new city. So, it makes sense that they get spruced up in the best of duds. So they are choosing something to wear, and they're getting outfitted. Another man comes forward with flower garlands, and he's very taken with the way that Krishna and Balaram look, and he offers to make garlands for them, so he makes a garland for them. So this is, Krishna and Balaram coming into Mathura. And I really am always remembered that, this episode of Krishna and Balaram coming into Mathura, Devamrita Swami once described this as being Krishna and Balaram performing pastimes of the perfect juvenile delinquents, So they kind of blow away the town, So they're coming in, and Washerman is, creating an issue for them. So they take off his head. And then after that happens, then, they dress up based on what they had. And they meet all kinds of other people. Of course, one of the next people they meet is this hunchback woman who is delivering chandan, or sandalwood pulp, that's actually intended again for Kamsa, because, that's the way the whole scene works in Mathura. Just like any capital city, a lot of the businesses and a lot of the activity that take place are focused around, and they revolve around the administrative head. In this case, the administrative head is Kamsa. So the hunchback woman has sandalwood pulp, and Krishna and Balaram say, "Oh, beautiful tall woman, please give us some of this sandalwood." And she immediately falls in love with Krishna and Balaram and starts smearing sandalwood pulp on the pair. And as she's doing this, Krishna is thinking, well, how can I repay her in some kind of way? How can I please her? Because she's got this spontaneous serving attitude. And we see that some people are just like that. When they meet devotees, or they meet Krishna himself, as some did during that period of time, immediately they're attracted. So Krishna, it describes in Krishna Bhakti, puts his feet on her feet, and then puts his hand on her cheeks and jerks upward. And immediately she becomes unhunchbacked and becomes actually a quite beautiful lady. She had not expected, any kind of reciprocation like this, but Krishna does this. And then, of course, she immediately is attracted by Krishna and forgets that she's there and it's an open place, and that, Balaram is there, some of the cowherd men are there. And she openly propositions Krishna, saying, "My dear Krishna, will you please come to my house?" And Krishna's a little embarrassed by this kind of straightforward, statement from the hunchback lady. And he says, "My dear lady, how can young men not feel a sense of wanting to be helped by ladies, beautiful ladies like you? But I have come here for a purpose, and I need to perform that purpose. And surely, when I'm finished with this purpose, I will come and visit you." And of course, we know that later he does. But the progress then is that as they are, coming to Mathura, everyone is attracted by them. It's said that the ladies of Mathura had heard about Krishna, even though they lived in Mathura and Krishna was in Vrindavan. And they always wondered, what is this person like? And when they heard about Krishna being in town, they heard that he might be coming, and now they hear that he's actually in town, and they don't want to miss out. There's no telling where he will go or how this will all play out. So it's mentioned that they didn't even dress themselves properly. Some put earrings only on one side, or put mascara on only one side of their face, or forgot to put part of their clothes on, or whatever it was, or sometimes put their dresses on upside down and this and that. And they rushed to the rooftop because they wanted to get a look at the Krishna who they'd heard so much about. And this was the way that they got a chance. And as they were looking at Krishna, they immediately became attracted to Krishna. And Krishna looked up at them, and there was a reciprocation of glances. And so in this way, Krishna was attracting everyone, both the men and the women. And some immediately fell in love with him and wanted to do something for him, while, as we know, others were unmoved. And of course, Krishna spent the night, and then the next day he was going to the wrestling arena. And I wonder if it sounds like this wrestling arena where these various wrestlers compete must have been something like what we read, in the Greek Colosseum, something like that, where people compete in various kinds of martial events to see who is powerful, because these professional wrestlers. And I think, too, that, at least the way it's described, that, in modern wrestling, there's only the possibility of holds and moves. You don't actually strike the body, but in wrestling of that time, it looks like striking was a legitimate form of combat in the wrestling arena. So sometimes they wrestle by grabbing each other and causing pain, by bending the other opponent's limbs in some kind of painful way. But when they come into the arena, what happens just before the wrestling match starts? Does anybody remember? There's another episode that happens. What's that? Yeah, Kuvalayapita. There's a great elephant. And this was one of Kamsa's men. Kamsa had stationed Kuvalayapita at the entrance. And Kuvalayapita, the elephant, had an elephant mahant. The person who is in charge of an elephant is called a mahant. And, some of you know that at one time in New Vrindavan we had an elephant. Actually, Kirtanan's idea was at one time to have many elephants, but that never came to be. But we had one elephant. It was our Chandra who found the elephant originally and brought it from Malaysia. So that's a whole story in itself. But this elephant was, presided over or controlled by this man who was given the task of killing Krishna and Balaram before they even made it to the wrestling arena. So when he saw them, he maneuvered the elephant in such a way that it was blocking them from coming into the wrestling arena. They had been summoned to go there, but they weren't allowed to enter because this elephant was in the way. And Krishna spoke to the elephant trainer, and he said, "My dear man, please get out of the way, or I will certainly send you to the boat of Yamaraj." So the elephant trainer, instead of complying with Krishna's request, he caused the elephant to attack. And so the elephant lunged forward, and Krishna simply just got out of the way of the elephant. And then the elephant tried to grab Krishna with his trunk. He had been trained to fight in various ways. And Krishna went around to the back of the elephant. Of course, the elephant couldn't see Krishna when Krishna was in the back of the elephant. And then Krishna grabbed the elephant by the tail and pulled it backwards. And so the elephant became very enraged and turned around to try to grab Krishna. And Krishna threw his body in such a way that the elephant tripped over Krishna. Of course, if you were, folks, don't try this at home. That if a normal person did that, the elephant would probably crush them instead of tripping over them. But because Krishna was Krishna, instead he became a impediment for the elephant, and the elephant tripped over Krishna. And this infuriated the elephant's owner, and the elephant's owner goaded the elephant to try to kill Krishna. So the elephant lunged at Krishna with its tusk, trying to puncture Krishna's body. And of course, Krishna was able to stay out of its way. But finally, he became very angry at the elephant trainer. So he jerked out one of the elephant's tusks and began to beat the elephant trainer, and killed the elephant trainer, and then eventually killed the elephant too. And so Krishna took one of the tusks of the elephant, and Balaram took the other tusk of the elephant, and they walked into the wrestling arena. So I forgot to actually mention, we'll continue with the story of the wrestling arena in a minute here, but there was the pastime where, still in Vrindavan, that there was a demon, and that demon's name was Palambasura. So I'll talk about this one particularly because Balaram kills Palambasura. Does anybody know what Palambasura looked like or who he was? What's that? Yes, he disguised himself as a cowherd boy. He was a demon at... Oh, well, I mean, there's a whole thing that each of these demons represents something, but I don't know, maybe so, but I don't remember. I didn't get a chance to review that part. I've heard of it, but somewhere I have a document, I think, that explains those, what each demon represents, and maybe so. But Palambasura, he saw the cowherd boys enjoying. They were, like boys do. And actually what's interesting is when you read what the cowherd boys do, when they play with one another, it's not very different from what kids do today. So in some ways it's kind of like, you wonder, how do these things perpetuate themselves? Like for centuries, kids do the same kind of thing, like they get up on each other's backs and they, play games where, some are, we call it cops and robbers, but in ancient times there was a similar thing. Some cowherd boys would take the role of dacoits, and the others would take the role of constables, same basic kind of stuff. They imitate animals, Kids do this kind of stuff today. I remember doing stuff like this, So it's interesting that when Palambasura came into their company, because he had, like many of Kamsa's associates, he had some mystic power. He was able to change himself where he looked like a young boy. So he came into the group, and Krishna immediately knew who he was. And so the boys chose sides, which is kind of what boys do today, So they made teams, 2 teams that would fight one another. And there was some game, and Krishna had a team, and Balaram had a team. This probably, I'm sure, happened many times, that Krishna was the head of one team and Balaram was the head of another team. So you had the Balaram team, and the Krishna team. The Krishna team was probably one color, and the Balaram team was another color. And so at any rate, they had this contest. And in this case, the Krishna team lost. So the nature of the play was that whichever team lost would have to carry the members of the team who won on their shoulders. So because Krishna's team lost, and evidently Palambasura had joined Krishna's team. Therefore, he had to carry someone on Balaram's team on his shoulder. And in this case, he decided to carry Balaram himself. So Balaram got on Palambasura's shoulders. And then, I don't know how far they had to carry them or, what the details were. But at any rate, as Palambasura had a plan, and Palambasura decided to wander off further and further and further away from where the boys were, because his intent was that he would kill Balaram when he got far enough away. Of course, he was under the impression that Balaram was just a young boy and nothing more. And as Balaram was being carried away, he got heavier and heavier and heavier. And as Balaram was getting so heavy, Palambasura was unable to keep him lifted and at the same time maintain his fake form of a young boy. So Palambasura suddenly became this giant demon that he actually was, with tusks and all this kind of demoniac form, shape. And Balaram looked down and said, how has this carrier become so different in every way? And then he realized, oh, this is a demon, and he probably intends to kill him. Now, one of the things that's interesting, you read these accounts of Krishna taking out various demons. In fact, it's usually described that when Krishna and Balaram lived in Vrindavan, they would play for some time, and basically every day a demon would show up, a different demon. They were all friends of Kamsa, and they all had mystic powers. And eventually they all figured out that the person Kamsa wanted to kill was Krishna. So they would come, and Krishna would kind of play with them for a while. But, with Balaram, there was no messing around. He was just... immediately, he said, oh, this is a demon. He intends to kill him. And he struck him one time on the top of the head. That was the end. So not much to tell. It was not a very dramatic struggle. There was no contest. Krishna just, finished Palambasura's life in one stroke. And it made such a big sound that all the other cowherd boys heard it for all the way around many different places, and they all came running. And when they came running, they saw, oh, here, there is Balaram, and Balaram standing beside this huge man who is shaped like a demon, and the demon is dead. And they were thinking, wow, well done, well done. And so for them, it was just kind of an afternoon's entertainment, but the demon in this case was, we also know that those demons that are killed directly by the Supreme Lord or by one of his expansions are in a very good situation, because due to the mercy of the Supreme Lord, if he kills a demon, that person gets their karma removed, and in many cases they get either impersonal liberation or some other thing like that. So they're very much benefited by being in the position of being directly killed by the hand of the Lord. Because the Supreme Lord doesn't have to incarnate to specifically kill any kind of a demon. He can do that with his various energies. It's not difficult for him. Now, there's another episode that also happened while they were in Vrindavan, and that was the killing of Daenuka Surah and his followers. Does anybody know what Daenuka Surah looked like? Yeah, he was a donkey. So Daenuka Surah lived in Talavan, and in New Vrindavan, sometimes the devotees used to joke that everybody in the Talavan area of New Vrindavan were donkeys. So, usually it was the devotees that lived in that area that would say, we're the donkeys from Talavan. So at any rate, that's an aside. But Daenuka Surah and his followers, who were also donkeys, lived in this area which had a lot of fruit trees or palms. I guess they were date palms and other kinds of trees with succulent fruits growing on them. And no one could go there because whenever someone tried to go there, these demoniac donkeys would chase them. And so the fruits were there and the fruits would rot. The donkeys didn't eat them, which is another kind of very demoniac thing that oftentimes demoniac people, they restrict others from enjoying things, and they can't or don't enjoy them even themselves. They're just wanting to keep other people from enjoying, and they want to stake out a territory. So this is kind of what Daenuka and his buddies were doing in this case. So the cowherd boys had been playing for some time, and they mentioned, actually, we know that not far from here is the Talavan forest there with all of the palms with all this luscious fruit on it. And no one can go there because of these donkeys. Wouldn't it be nice if we could go there and get these fruits? What do you think, Krishna? So, they were kind of setting up the situation so that Krishna would go there. So Krishna and Balaram go there. And Balaram, he just grabs one of the trees and shakes it violently, and all the fruits drop out of it. And immediately the cowherd boys are getting these various fruits, and they're enjoying. And as they're enjoying, because of the sound of the tree being shaken like that, it immediately alerted Daenuka and his associates that someone was in their area. And Daenuka came, and the first thing he did was kick Balaram in the chest. And Balaram didn't really seem to notice or mind, But then he backed off and he did it a second time. And this time, as he tried to kick Balaram in the chest, Balaram grabbed his hind legs and started to twirl him around. And, he twirled him around faster and faster, and the life air came out of the demon. And then he threw him up, and he landed on one of the trees, and the tree fell over from the weight of the demon and the thrust of the, the throw, and cracked at one tree and cracked another tree, and it fell down. And then the other demons that were also donkeys began to attack. And Krishna and Balaram did the same thing with all of them. They would grab them, whirl them around, and throw them in the trees. And evidently they were different colors, because it describes then at the end of it all, it looked like various different colored clouds in trees. And of course, some of the trees were broken and they fell to the ground, and it looked as if a hurricane had come through the area, all these broken trees and these demons in the trees. So now I'll pick back up where we were on, Krishna and Balaram coming into Mathura and coming into the wrestling arena. So Kamsa had heard that this eighth child would kill him. And finally, he was seeing this eighth child. And we know that Kamsa had been having bad dreams, that he dreamed that he was naked and smearing oil on himself, and that he was being pulled in a chariot that was being pulled by donkeys, and he could see holes in his shadow, and when he looked in a mirror, he couldn't see his own head. So all these things were, omens that something very bad was going to happen very soon. So he had made various plans, He was trying to be sure that somehow or other Krishna would be killed. But Krishna and Balaram were now entering the wrestling arena after killing the elephant, and each one had a broken tusk over their shoulder. And so the Christian book describes that not only did they have a broken tusk over their shoulder, but they were sprinkled with the blood of the elephant, and for that reason, they looked very beautiful. And so they enter into the arena, and of course, the game starts. And there's two big wrestlers. One of them is Chanura, and the other is Mushtika. So these are trained wrestlers who were probably maybe twice or three times the size of Krishna and Balaram. And they were older men. Krishna and Balaram were, like teenagers or something like that, and more or less in that range of age. And so when the wrestling arena was assembled and all the spectators were there, some of the cowherd men were there, and it mentioned that the ladies were there too, and they're discussing with one another. And as Krishna and Balaram come into the arena, it describes that according to their mentality, people saw them in different ways, that those who were cowherd men saw them as the best of their dynasty. The ladies saw Krishna and Balaram as Cupid personified. The people that were with Kamsa saw them as upstarts. Kamsa saw them as death personified. Each person saw them in somewhat of a different perspective, owing to their own internal mind, their purity, their sense of, knowledge about spiritual life. So when the wrestling began, some complained that how is it that this assembly has these two young boys fighting these two older men? This is not fair. There's no justice in this. We should leave this assembly. We should protest against it. But it didn't look like Krishna and Balaram were having that much difficulty with the wrestlers. So both had engaged. Krishna was engaged with Chanura, and Balaram was engaged with Mushtika. And they were slapping each other and pulling each other, and various wrestling moves were being used. And as this whole fight continued, it was very dramatic. And eventually, we find that Krishna, he whirls Chanura around just like he was doing with the ass demons or the donkeys, and Chanura dies. And then Balaram slaps Mushtika, and Mushtika is dead. And when Krishna and Balaram become victorious in what appeared to be a gravely mismatched fight, a cheer goes up from the crowd. And there's, of course, musicians there and others who, make a sound of victory for Krishna and Balaram. Kamsa's completely disturbed by this and tells them to stop making the sound for Krishna's victory. And he says, this Vasudeva and this Nanda Maharaj, they are conspiring. Kill them and arrest everyone that's with them and drive these two boys from here. He's making all these commands to his army and his personal security force. And before they can start to move, Krishna jumps up on the dais where Kamsa is and grabs him by the hair and pulls him into the wrestling arena himself. And he just starts hitting Kamsa again and again in his chest, and eventually Kamsa gives up his life. So it's over for Kamsa. And since Krishna doesn't want to take all the glory, Kamsa has 8 brothers or something like that, and they immediately start attacking. So it's Balaram that takes out Kamsa's 8 brothers, or however many it is, something like that. There's some number of brothers, and so they're all dispatched by Balaram. So this is Krishna and Balaram, It's actually interesting, in the Krishna book, it describes that when Kamsa was killed by Krishna, he went to Vaikuntha, which is interesting, It describes that because Krishna's hand had touched Kamsa, that he was purified. At any rate, this is kind of the amazing properties of Krishna and Balaram, that they could do all these things. Of course, we know eventually Krishna sets up a government in Mathura. He brings back Ugrasena, who was the father of Kamsa, and sets up a government in Mathura. And then, we go on with that whole episode. See what else we have here that I wanted to. Oh. So, of course, Krishna and Balaram had lived for many years outside of Vrindavan. And at one point, Balaram decided he wanted to see the residents of Vrindavan. So we know that one time Krishna had sent Uddhava to Vrindavan as an emissary. But in this case, we find that Balaram, on his own decision, comes to Vrindavan to see the devotees there at Vrindavan. So after a long time being away, when Balaram comes to Vrindavan, everyone is overjoyed, and they ask, how are things going in Mathura? That what is Krishna like these days? Nanda and Yashoda say, does he sometimes remember his poor mother and father who are really wishing to see him? Is there some chance he might come again this way? And then after some exchanges between Balaram and his mother and father, then the gopis come. And the gopis, they are so happy to see Balaram. And it appears that Balaram has gopis too. It's a different set of gopis, and it describes in Krishna book that when Balaram had lived in Vrindavan, back when Krishna and Balaram were still in Vrindavan, those gopis were too young. But now, when they're much older, then Balaram had pastimes with his own gopis. And so Krishna has pastimes with a certain group of gopis, and Balaram has pastimes with his own gopis. And Balaram wound up staying in Vrindavan for about 2 months. Now, when Balaram has his various pastimes, one of the things he does is there is a daughter of Varuna, and she's called Varuni. Evidently, she's some kind of like maple syrup or some kind of sap that comes out of trees that's very sweet, and at least one of her manifestations is like that. And so Varuna sends his daughter there, and she makes this Varuni beverage, we call it, and Balaram will enjoy with his various gopis drinking this Varuni beverage, which is super sweet. And we all know that enormous amounts of sugar have an effect something like alcohol. So he becomes somewhat intoxicated. So in one of these episodes, Balaram was enjoying with his gopis, and his eyes were red and rolling around, and he thought, now would be a good time to have a dip in the Yamuna. So as most of us, when we get very hot, we want to get into water, so we get cooled off a little bit. So he said, Yamuna, please come here. And, because he looked kind of intoxicated, Yamuna didn't take his request seriously. But this angered Balaram. So Balaram said, why do you not come, you wretched river? I will take my plow and break you into many, many tributaries. And so Yamuna was shocked and terrified when Balaram said this, and she immediately appeared and begged Balaram's forgiveness that, please, I didn't take your request seriously, but forgive this offense of your servant. And then Balaram enjoyed in the water. And what's interesting is there's another pastime of this time, Balaram and a demon, and I don't think Krishna was involved in this at all. It was just Balaram and a demon known as Dvivida. Now, does anybody know what Dvivida looked like? What's that? Yeah, he was a gorilla. Actually, Dvivida's whole pastime goes all the way back to Ramachandra. He was one of Ramachandra's gorillas, you know. It's interesting saying that. We have the word guerrilla army these days too, you know, but these were actual gorillas, you know. So the fact was that Dvivida had been part of Ramachandra's army, but he had come into bad association. So as a result, his mind became disturbed, and he would do all kinds of mischief in the area. It said that there were sages, and you know, when they would perform their sacrifice, Dvivida gorilla would you know, poop on their sacrifices, and he would do other kinds of annoying and noxious things. Sometimes he would go, because he was so powerful, to the water and push the water with his hands, and it would cause great waves. It would cause flooding in many places. And as a result of this flooding, people were inconvenienced. Well, one time in the Raivataka area, then Balaram was enjoying, and Dvivida happened to be there. And he saw Balaram enjoying with these various gopis, and he became attracted to the gopis for the most part. And he thought, you know, well, I should enjoy these young ladies. So he came there, and, you know, he started to, said that he climbed up in a tree, and he made these sounds, Kila, Kila. And people were, you know, the gopis thought this was funny, you know. They were laughing at Dvivida. And he would do this thing he describes in Krishna book, where he would move his eyebrows and show his teeth, you know, kind of like that, which is interesting. I used to see this in cartoons back in the day, as they say. You know, I'm often surprised that I remember in the older cartoons that I used to watch as a kid, I would see these things that I recognize now as being Vedic things, like this idea of, you know, rolling your eyebrows back and showing your teeth. There's many cartoon characters that did that. And I also saw the thing where you would smell a child's head. I always thought that was strange, you know, and I would see that in cartoons, you know. I don't know where these cartoonists of the Western world came up with these. I don't know whether there was some time where in America people used to do these same things. I think Groucho Marx used to do the thing with his eyebrows that was similar to what Dvivida was doing, you know, moving his eyebrows back and forth and showing his teeth. But at any rate, then when that didn't have the effect that he wanted, Dvivida would come before the ladies and point to the lower parts of his body. And, you know, at a certain point, Dvivida decided to be more obnoxious each time he tried to figure out how to do something that was more and more obnoxious. So he began to rip Balaram's clothing off. And at this point, Balaram thought, okay, enough with this guy. So Balaram began to stand as ready to fight. And Dvivida, you know, grabbed a tree and tried to hit Balaram with it. And he struck Balaram, but Balaram didn't even seem to notice. And then there began a fight between them where they were ripping up trees and hitting each other with them, you know, instead of, you know, people fighting with sticks, they were using full trees. And, you know, and the Krishna book describes that they, after ripping up one tree after another, the whole place became denuded of trees, and it was, you know, nothing left from trees, so they began to throw rocks at each other, and these were kind of boulder-sized rocks, and they were throwing back and forth, and at at a certain point then, Krishna, I think, slapped Dravida Gorilla, and finally Dravida Gorilla fell dead, So this was the great power of Balaram. So we know as well that Dravida Gorilla was, I'm not Dravida, but Balaram was a friend to Duryodhan. In fact, Balaram was the one who taught Duryodhan how to fight. He was expert with a club. We know that that's Balaram's weapon. He uses a club. And Duryodhan learned how to do club battle from Balaram. And this is one of the reasons why Balaram could not engage in the battle of Kurukshetra. Balaram pledged to be neutral because he couldn't fight against his own brother, and he didn't want to fight against Duryodhan, who he was friends with. But at the same time, that meant that he could not join Krishna's army, because if he joined Krishna's army, he would have to fight against Duryodhan. But he couldn't join Duryodhan's army because he would have to fight against his own brother. So he decided not to fight at all. And so during the entire episode of the Kurukshetra war, Lord Balaram, he was on a pilgrimage to various holy sites, and he went from one place to another. And it mentions all the places that he visited, which were many. There's so many holy places in India, so Balaram was the one who took a break. Of course, at one point Balaram comes back, and it's at the very time, I think, where Bhimsena is in a contest with Duryodhan. And at that point, because Duryodhan is his friend, he tries to get them to stop, but there's no way that the battle is going to end there, because it's almost the end of the Kurukshetra war. And the outcome of the fight between Bhimsena and Duryodhan will finally decide the entire battle. So they continue to fight. Because they do, Balaram leaves again. Of course, during this episode where Balaram is traveling, visiting various holy places, at one point he comes to not Kurukshetra, but I forget where it was, that Naimisharanya, I think, and the sages at Naimisharanya are collecting there for this sacrifice. And the person who's been given the opportunity to speak to all the sages is Romaharshan. And Romaharshan's sitting on a Vyasasan. And when Balaram comes into the assembly, Romaharshan does not rise for Balaram, and which everyone else does, because they all understand that Balaram is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. But Romaharshan doesn't rise. So Balaram goes up to Romaharshan and takes a small piece of grass and strikes Romaharshan with the grass, and Romaharshan dies. And so, nobody expected an event like that. They had just elected Romaharshan to be the representative of all the sages and speak, but Romaharshan is now dead. So the sages say, my dear Balaram, whatever you do is perfect. But, the sages had just given a benediction to Romaharshan that he would have a long life. And instead of having a long life, Balaram had just ended it. So, they asked Balaram, well, now we don't have a speaker, and we had just benedicted Romaharshan with a long life, and you have just killed a Brahmana, so what do we do about these things? And so Balaram thinks for a while, and the idea then is that the sages will be hearing not from Romaharshan, but from his son. So that's when that decision is made. And they also find that his long life will be transferred from Romaharshan to his son, and that as a penance, the sages ask Balaram to kill, I forget, someone who was causing them some kind of issue. I didn't read that through this morning, so I don't remember who it was, but there was some kind of disturbance that they were experiencing, and as a penance for killing their speaker, Romaharshan, then Lord Balaram undertakes that. So any rate, maybe we'll end here. Does anybody have any questions, or does anybody have any other pastimes of Balaram that they would like to mention? Yes.
Maharaj, Hare Krishna. I just wanted to know, how do we understand that what Balaram did? Because at the time of the war of Kurukshetra, battle of Kurukshetra, that he just walked away from a Dharma Yudh.
From who?
From Dharma Yudh, a battle
Right.
to reinstate Dharma. So how do we know? I mean, this may not be from, absolute, of course, because Balaram is absolute person, supreme person of Godhead, so it's fine, he can do, and Krishna is there.
Right.
But from another angle, when we are explaining to people, how do we understand what Balaram did was right? Because he just walked away from the battle.
Right, he walked away from the battle. Oh, that's an interesting question. I've never really thought of that. Well, of course, Krishna was already in the battle, but he was also neutral in the battle, even though he was participating in it. I don't know if you can explain it from a Dharma Shastra point of view, and why he would decide to not participate. But since he's the Supreme Personality of Godhead, he's free to make his own decisions about things. But more than that, I can't, nothing comes to mind immediately, but maybe if somebody else has an idea, or maybe later on something will come to my mind, but I can't think of anything more to say about that particular issue.
There was one more this thing about why Balaram was maintaining his friendship with Duryodhan despite Duryodhan's very negative behavior towards the Pandavas, who are dear devotees of Krishna.
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration. I've thought about it, and it seems to me that it just goes to show that the Supreme Lord never really leaves anybody out, even if they may be really off track. Like obviously Duryodhan was off track. But somehow or other, although he was negative to the Pandavas and he was completely inimical to Krishna, he was friends with Duryodhan. In fact, when the other episode that was really interesting, when was it Samba that kidnapped Lakshmana? She was the daughter of Duryodhan, and he wanted to marry her, even though she wasn't particularly attracted to him. The Kurus were about to get into a battle with the Yadus, so at this point, the Yadus sent Balaram to negotiate because he was friends with both sides. And Duryodhan was ruling things in Hastinapur, and at the same time, he was one of the Yadus, so he came to negotiate for the release of Samba, because the assembled Kurus had captured Samba. Individually they couldn't have done it, but they did it as a collective group. So they were actually kind of amazed to see the power that Samba had, and when Balaram came for his release, the crews just, they were happy to see Balaram. But when they found out why he was there, that he was negotiating for the release of Samba, they became indifferent, and they said, how dare the Yadus ask for something like this? We are the Kurus. They're only ruling their little area because we allow them to, and now the shoes are trying to rise to the top of the head. They, said all these very degrading things about the Yadus. And Balaram became angry, and he got his plow. He was about to drag the entirety of Hastinapur into the river. And of course, when the Kurus felt the earth shaking and everything, they all came out and then they apologized to Balaram. So at any rate, we see that he was friends, particularly with Duryodhana, and somehow, because Duryodhana had that one connection with the Supreme Lord, then he was not in as bad a shape as he would have been if he'd had no connection with the Supreme Lord. So that's the interesting thing about the Supreme, that he can come to people in these various ways, that if you can't be attracted to God in one way, you might be attracted to God in a different way. And in this way, it's a saving feature. And this is another reason why I think there's so many forms of God, that people who are not attracted to one form may find themselves somehow or other moved to an attraction in a different form. And in this way, their lives are still benedicted. So I think that was one of the takeaways for why Balaram was, and Krishna could be rightly antagonistic towards him because he was antagonistic to the Pandavas. But you have one side of Krishna, Balaram, that was favorable to Duryodhana. So Duryodhana had at least one saving item of positive grace that was in his favor. Any other? Yeah.
Hare Krishna, Maharaj. So we know that Balaram is the first guru, the first spiritual master, and also he comes during Gaura Lila as Nityananda Prabhu. So I was wondering if maybe you could elaborate on the mood that we should have, especially on today, for not only Balaram but Nityananda Prabhu, and how we can grow in devotional service by having a proper mood too.
Well, the principle of guru is the principle of following the regulations imposed on us by the spiritual master. We find that when we discuss the concept of spiritual master, the spiritual master is the person who helps us to understand the process for becoming purified. We have voluntarily come to the material world, and we have voluntarily entangled ourselves in many kinds of material desire. And because we are lost in various material desire, we neither understand how to get out of it, nor do we have the strength to get out of it, nor are we even inclined to get out of the material world. But because we come in contact with devotees and we get some special mercy of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, we learn that there is a spiritual world. We learn that there is such a thing as spiritual life, and that there is a goal of life. And to go back to the spiritual world, to become purified, we learn there's a process for doing that. And although to some extent the process of spiritual life may seem foreign to us and be somewhat unaccommodating to us because we are right now in a denatured state of existence. So the spiritual master tells us step by step how we can make progress. And that's why there's a necessity of a spiritual master. That just the Vedic knowledge by itself will not save us, because we won't understand how to put it in the right perspective. And as a result, we will probably flounder in our attempt to come out of the material world. But the spiritual master is expert because he's been trained and he's followed the process. And therefore, he has the knowledge of how to tailor the process of purification in a way that will be practical for us as individuals. Of course, in ISKCON, we know it's kind of a blanket formula. It's not absolutely tailored. But still, even in our practice of Krishna consciousness, we see not everybody's doing exactly the same thing. And as a result, so it's the spiritual master who helps us to put ourselves in the right perspective, put ourselves in the right context for easily making progress, rather than, kind of struggling and maybe failing in the journey back to the spiritual world. So this is why we owe a great debt to the spiritual master. And through the words and the example of the spiritual master, we get the strength. So we kind of see that Balaram is both things. He embodies, or he is the personification of spiritual strength, and at the same time he's a personification of the spiritual master. So someone who follows the words of the spiritual master has a certain spiritual strength that comes from that. And if we don't follow the words of the spiritual master, then we have that inherent weakness of not actually connecting with the parampara. And of course, the spiritual master is supposed to be someone who represents the Vedic scriptures, and he's supposed to be one who represents the parampara. So both things are there. He is the embodiment of the scriptures, what he says we should be reading in scriptures. And at the same time, he understands the conclusions that have been arrived at by our past acharyas when we have some confusion or some apparent contradictory point. The spiritual master can bring that out. So on the appearance day of Sri Lord Balaram, we can think in terms that like Balaram, like Nityananda, he is the original spiritual master. And the principle of spiritual master is the guidance we need to understand what's relevant for us and what's more important and what's less important. And if we can follow that, we will be delivered from the material world. Okay, so thank you all very much. All glories to Lord Balaram, whose appearance it is today. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.